You tell a Christmas story in the book.
Are you spoiling that chapter? It's called Die Hard.
All right. Well, I'm not going to spoil it.
Okay.
It's really good.
I was very proud of that chapter.
Why? I mean, it's just
Because the ending that's a Christmas story is just like, I know everyone reading it's going to go Google it, be like, these can't be real, but it was real.
That it was on Christmas. Yes, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that this has to do with the bigger picture. We don't have to do the big reveal, but the bigger picture of there was an Iron Curtain and it was coming down in complex ways. How would you define the Iron Curtain? There's a set of ideologies, a set of countries united by an ideology, and a set of countries united by a different ideology. And there's a curtain that divided them, and it eventually came down. So how would you describe how it came down?
It came. I hate that I can never ever remember if this was Hemingway. No, it was Hemingway.
It was Mark Twain.
No, it came down two ways: gradually, then suddenly. The thing with the Iron Curtain and the Warsaw Pact, these were a bunch of nations with, run under communism, but they were all, almost all, under the sway of Moscow. So if they were going to make big changes, Moscow had to prove it. It was in the 50s when Hungary decided to rebel, or not rebel, liberalize, and they even were thinking of leaving the Warsaw Pact, and the Russians sent in the tanks, and you had the development of what was called the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was the idea that it is the duty of all the Warsaw Pact nations, if another country tries to, and this was also in 1968 in the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, if a nation wants to leave socialism, it is incumbent on those socialist nations to do whatever is necessary to make sure there isn't a counter-revolution. So they were very much under Moscow's thumb. And one of the big ways it changed was one man, and that was Mikhail Gorbachev. And he was the first Russian leader to be born after the October Revolution. He grew up, and his grandfather was arrested for being a Trotskyite, and the other one, was arrested for this or that. He saw his village starve as a result of Stalin. So even though he was a very committed communist, he also was very and increasingly skeptical of authoritarianism. And in Poland, for example, you had the Solidarity movement, and this was a labor union movement, and the government didn't know what to do. They were getting a lot of support from the peoples. They had strikes that, and the Gdansk shipyard was when one of them started. And basically Moscow told them, either you crack down or we're cracking down on you. And they're like, all right. And they declared martial law, and they, arrested the leaders, put them away. But then when Gorbachev, was in charge, there wasn't a gun to their back. And it was the communist leaders themselves who were like, you know what? There was this really funny moment where Lech Walesa is meeting with Margaret Thatcher, and he's telling her what Solidarity, the movement, wants. And she had been meeting with the Polish government as well. And she's like, look, like, tell them, like, what, because the government wanted her to tell them that we want to negotiate and work things out. She goes, all right, tell the government what it is that you're asking for. And he just points to the ceiling. He's like, oh yeah, our meetings are bugged anyway. But they then had the freedom because they knew that Gorbachev wasn't forcing them to drive Solidarity underground. So they had the idea of, like, let's work together with these people. And as a result of this, Poland liberalized and freed itself fairly easily and with a minimum of bloodshed in 1989. And there was this whole argument for the Vietnam War with something called domino theory, which is if you lose Vietnam, then you're going to lose Laos, then you're going to lose Cambodia. One by one, the countries are going to turn communist like dominoes. But people didn't realize the reverse was true, because after Poland liberalized, then you have, Hungary, then you have, Czechoslovakia, then you had East Germany and the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it's a great thing, because as this is happening, the people are looking around and they're like, wait, well, like that's it. Like, this has got to be a trick. And it wasn't a trick. So one of my favorite books, which was a big inspiration for this one, was by my favorite historian. I apologize to David Petrusha and Arthur Herman, my second and third. They're tied. But Victor Sebastian wrote a book called Revolution 1989. And he just talked about that year and how all these countries, one after another, liberalized. And it's just such a and none of them thought this was possible. One of my favorite moments in this book is Helmut Kohl, who was the head of West Germany, is in Warsaw with Lech Walesa, discussing the Berlin Wall. And Lech Walesa is like, I don't think it's going to be around for like another, few years. And Helmut Kohl laughs in his face. And he goes, look, you're young. This isn't how things work. Like, this is going to take some doing. It fell the next day. And Helmut Kohl literally says, I'm at the wrong party. And he got in a plane and got out of Warsaw. So why this book has a broader message than the actual stories of these incidents is that as these wonderful things are happening, the universal consensus at the time is it's never going to happen. Or if it does going to happen, it's going to happen only through an enormous amount of carnage and blood. And when it doesn't, then everyone's like, oh, it was inevitable. Mm-hmm. You didn't say it was inevitable at the time. You only said it was inevitable after the fact. And the other thing that brought me a lot of joy is there are so many moments of men with guns saying, we're not shooting anyone. Because they wanted several Tiananmen squares. Mm-hmm. They wanted it in East Berlin. They wanted it in Romania. They wanted it in Moscow. And these strong, tough, trained men with guns were like, no, we're not shooting the civilians. And then everything else was history.
Yeah, just as surprising as the mass violence committed by like police and the army on its own citizenry, equally surprising is when they choose not to.
Yeah.
Somehow.
Yeah.
And what is that? How do you explain 1989? How do you explain this progress that happened so suddenly? How do you explain that at the beginning of the 20th century, so much revolution happened that created communism? And how do you explain then the collapse of that across so many nations at the same time?
I think a large part of it had to do with the closer interconnections between people like Gorbachev and Thatcher and Gorbachev and Reagan, because both of them visited Red Square, and in the years before, these are enemies. They want to invade, they want to kill us. The Americans thought this about the Russians thought this about the Americans, obviously not so much the British, and they got on really well. When Gorbachev came to Chequers, which is the prime minister's countryside estate, Thatcher sat him down and she's lecturing him about human rights, and she's lecturing him about economics, and she's lecturing him about this and that. And then she's lecturing him about why he's an eating while he's yelling at her. And he goes, Mrs. Thatcher, like, I know you have a lot of strong opinions. I do too. I haven't been sent here to recruit you to the Communist Party. And she just started laughing. But right away, there was such a sense in the air of we can do better. We're spending all this money on missiles. We're spending all this money on the military. It's expensive. And for what? We don't have to be looking at each other as enemies. We can try to work together to kind of, at the very least, lower the volume and the heat.
How much credit do you give to Gorbachev, the man? So meaning, how much power does a single individual have?
I could not give him more credit. I had a tweet last year where I said, who do you think is the greatest person alive right now? And my answer by far would be Gorbachev. Then he died. I don't know who it is right now. But
it's just funny because Gorbachev also had a tweet.
But it was
and he said, oh, sure. That would be a good. Now, I wish I interviewed Gorbachev and asked him the famous question of what would you like best about Michael Malice.